Okay. So lesson 5 today is charts, graphs, and flowcharts. And by the time we complete our lesson today, you'll be able to identify charts, graphs, and flowcharts and interpret information using these types of visual aids. And we'll see what our audio says here.
Charts, graphs, and flowcharts are ways to present information visually. Like tables, charts and graphs can present a great deal of numerical information in a relatively small amount of space. In social studies, authors often use these elements to show information that would be too lengthy to describe in a narrative passage. A flowchart is a graphic that describes a sequence. It communicates the steps of a process quickly by using concise, explanatory text. As with other areas of the GED test, questions about charts, graphs, and flowcharts will test your ability to interpret information at various depth of knowledge levels through the use of complex reading skills and thinking skills.
So like we've done before with different types of visual aids and visualizing information. So maps, right? It falls in that same kind of category where that way you can display geographic information and statistics and things like that, involves space and place, right? And same thing, we looked at timelines, right? That's another way to visualize events as they're happening. We have a variety of means to display information visually, beyond just a box of text, just beyond a paragraph or something. And it makes it much easier to consume that information, especially when it's based on, just like data points and things like that. So we'll look over here. Let's go ahead and get into the next screen here. So what we got, right, is a graph. And of course, it's always important to, take into account what the title is, right? And especially when it comes to any type of visual information, look at the title first, because that way you're going to know exactly what we're involved with. And in this case, it's manufacturing growth in Illinois between the decade of 1880 to 1900s, 20 years is the time span. And over here, our first text box at the top says the title of a graph tells what information that graph contains. Here, the graph shows changes in the number of manufacturing establishments found in Illinois between 1880 and 1900. And the next box says each graph features two axes. On this line graph, the y-axis indicates the number of manufacturing establishments, while the x-axis shows the year for which the data was recorded. And I don't know if in math or science, have you looked at like stuff, plotting on a X and Y axis yet? Has that come up at all? Like on number lines or anything? So a Y axis runs vertically and an X axis runs horizontally. And that's regardless of, whether it's in social studies or math or anything. You might be like plotting points on a graph or something. So you always make sure y-axis up and down, x-axis left and right, side to side. And it says over here, we look at our y-axis, right? We have values going up. And you have to tilt your head a little bit to the side to look at it. But it says manufacturing establishments. What's really important here, right, is where it says in paragraphs by the thousands. So that means that's sort of like your scale, right? So when it says 10, 20, 30, 40 up the side there, that's 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, and 40,000. So you always have to keep that in mind. Make sure you understand what values they're looking for. And it'll usually be in that text along with it. So they make it simpler to look at instead of having that big number of 10,000, 20,000 on the side there. They've reduced it, and you just need to make sure that you understand that it's by the thousands. That's what we're counting in. And then along the x-axis, right, is the years. So it goes from 1880 up to 1900. So that's an increment of 10, excuse me. It's a total of 20 years. And we've dealt with this a little bit in timelines, right? We have to find out, how is that sliced up? And in this case, there's just, it's by 10-year increments. So we have 1880, 1890, and 1900. So we can always work our math that way when we come to our questions. We know the increments there are basically set up in 10 years. Each little tick mark represents 10 years. So 1880, 1890, and 1900. All right. And we'll see that. Okay. And we got a little more audio here with some visual aids.
This question asks, which two levels of government were in possible conflict in the Plessy decision? Option A, federal and state governments. Option B, state and local governments. Option C, county and state governments. Option D, two parts of the federal government. This question relies on test takers to have some basic familiarity with civil rights issues. Although the flowchart does not specifically indicate what law James Plessy broke when he was arrested, you can draw on your knowledge of civil rights history to conclude that Plessy was probably arrested in a southern state. In fact, James Plessy was arrested in Louisiana, and the law requiring separate cars for different ethnic groups was a state law. Because the state law conflicted with the Constitution, the two levels of government in conflict were the federal and state governments. Option A is the correct answer. However, even if you do not have a good working knowledge of civil rights history, you could narrow down the answer choices to option A because the flowchart states that Plessy's attorneys argued that the law was a violation of the 14th Amendment. Because the 14th Amendment is part of the U.S. Constitution, upholding the rights it guarantees would fall under federal jurisdiction.
Yeah. So another type of visual aid that we're going to look at, right? The flow chart. So it's usually set up, it's kind of like a timeline, right? So it has information kind of moving in one direction. It's a cause and effect type of scenario. So each box has a bullet point in there. It has some information. And we dealt with Plessy versus Ferguson before. We talked about that. That was the gentleman that got into the white only train car and was told to leave, and that sparked a civil rights case, and that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that that's where the precedent for separate but equal was maintained. So as long as people of color supposedly had equal facilities, access to education, whatever it may be, as long as it was equal, they could be segregated. And we talked about that as far as that wasn't reality. They never had the same facilities or access to care and things like that. The white people did. But then we have each text box showing how that progressed from the event itself to the Supreme Court ruling, right? And the fact that it became a lawsuit by Plessy, and then it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically overturned the decision and maintained that separate but equal status. All right. So all about sort of cause and effect there. Okay, so on to the quiz. Here we go. Unit 3, Lesson 5. Okay. And we're back to our manufacturing graph. We're gonna see the Plessy versus Ferguson flow chart again here in a little bit. But back to our graph, and our using logic point here says to interpret a graph, find how both axes relate to one another at certain points. To find the number of manufacturing establishments in 1890, scan up from 1890 on the x-axis and find the number on the y-axis, right? So real simple, right? How many manufacturing establishments were there in Illinois in 1880. You look right around 15,000, right? We have increments of 10 on the line. That falls right around the middle there. So we know it's about 15,000. Same thing, if we want to know what it was in 1890, we have 20,000. When we get to 1900, we're up there close to 40,000. So we see incredible amount of growth between 1890 and 1900. All right, our first question. Tracy, would you like to read the first question for us, please?
Yes. During the 1890s, what happened to the number of manufacturing establishments in Illinois? A. They increased slightly. B. They decreased slightly. C. They remained nearly the same. D. They increased dramatically. A.
Actually, it's D. So you're on the right track. What it's asking for is from 1890 to 1900. So we see, it increased slightly between 1880 and 1890. But then when we get to 1890, that decade, right, is what they're referring to, the decade of the 1890s, it really shot straight up. So that, and I did the same thing. I looked at this earlier and I wasn't really paying attention. So yeah, it's D as in dog, that it increased dramatically in that second decade. Okay, number 2. So now we have a new flow chart, and I'm going to read through this one. This one's really crazy, and I'm going to give you some context for this as well. So events leading to the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act seems really specific, right? But so what happens here? Charles Guiteau writes to President James A. Garfield asking for a high-level job in his new administration. So what happens next, right? Our flow chart. President Garfield does not respond, angering Mr. Guiteau. Our third flow chart piece there. Mr. Guiteau shoots President Garfield partly as a result of the snub. When President Garfield dies, Chester A. Arthur becomes president. He was the vice president. President Garfield's assassination helps focus attention on the need to reform the process by which people obtain federal jobs. Next, Congress passes the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which creates the Civil Service Commission. It took about 2 years to get that act through Congress. And finally, many federal jobs become obtainable only by merit rather than through political connections. So if you lived in the second half of the 1800s, you would probably think that presidential assassinations were commonplace. We had Lincoln, of course, was assassinated in 1865. Garfield was assassinated in 1881, and then 20 years later, McKinley is assassinated in 1901. So what this is sort of digging into here, because it just seems kind of bizarre. At that time, presidents, like today, presidents can appoint a lot of their top officials, right? They appoint all their cabinet members, and of course they get approved by Congress, right? They nominate judges, not just the Supreme Court, but other federal judges, and ambassadors, so very high level positions. At this time, basically, you could go to the president for lower level jobs within the federal government. The federal government was a lot smaller, but there was still a lot of jobs there. And in this case, it's Mr. Guiteau. He wanted to work he wanted to be a consul in France. He wanted to work in the American embassy in Paris. So before Garfield was elected, he started campaigning for him. And he wrote like a piece to get published, about why Garfield is the best choice for president at this time. And, it's kind of similar stuff happens today as far as, donors sometimes will get positions in administrations and things. So but he was just this kind of random dude, and he was trying to get this position, and then people would just meet with the president for jobs. That was part of his role at that time. They would go to the White House and they would, sort of ask for positions. But he had written Garfield, and Garfield, for a number of reasons, didn't want to appoint him. And so he got mad and he shoots the president, not just because he was mad that he didn't get the job, but he also thought that killing Garfield would relieve some political tension that would also allow him to get the job. So he was still hoping he would get the job after he assassinated the president. Anyway, after this, they look into this idea that, well, maybe the president has too much responsibility as far as appointing these places, and maybe it's relying too much on favoritism. These people are getting these jobs because they're campaigned for the president, or they donated to his campaign, or their friends. So at this point, this helped reform the civil service. And so like today, I'm kind of going on about this, but so like if you want a job in the foreign service, you take a foreign service exam, and then you get to work, for the State Department in certain, lower level positions. You could work for an ambassador at an embassy and things like that. So just kind of following through again, that established that's the cause and effect. Charles Guiteau wanted a job in the Garfield administration. That leads to the end here, where now federal jobs are attainable through merit. You have to have the education, you have to have the qualifications, you have to pass exams to earn them, rather than your political affiliation or connection. All right, hope that all makes sense, because it was kind of a crazy story. So back to our questions. Number 2, Christiana, could you read question 2 for us?
Okay. It says, based on the information presented in the flowchart, which of the following events directly resulted in the presidency of Chester A. Arthur? A, the passage of the please, what's that word? The P word?
Pendleton.
Okay, Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. B, the election of Chester A. Arthur. The election of Chester A. Arthur. C, the assassination of President James Garfield. D, the application of Charles
Guiteau.
J, for the government job. Is it B?
It's C. So
C.
What we're looking at is what event directly resulted in the presidency of Chester A. Arthur. So it was the assassination of President Garfield. Arthur was his vice president. Once he's assassinated, then order of succession, he becomes president. So yeah, 2 is C as in cat. Assassination of James Garfield. Okay, here's our flow chart again. Sasha Gay, would you like to read question 3 for us?
How did President Garfield's death affect civil service reform? A, Congress passed a law that replaced many patronage jobs with jobs obtained through merit. B, jobs could no longer be obtained through the Civil Service Commission. C, the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act was rejected by a very narrow margin. D, the federal jobs were obtained only through political connections from that point forward? Is it A?
Yeah, A, right? They see that the death of President Garfield was due to, partially at least, to the fact that these appointments led to, you know, this Mr. Duteau being angered that he didn't get an appointment. That allowed Congress to realize, well, you know, maybe we were giving the president too much responsibility, and maybe that's too much power for him to appoint all these positions. Maybe they should be merit-based rather than based on political affiliation. So yeah, 3 is A. Number 4, Grace, would you like to read number 4?
All right. Number 4. Which of the following gives the best reason for displaying the information here on a flow chart rather than on a graph? A, text cannot be used with graphs. B, the A-axis and Y-axis on a flow chart are difficult to display. C, there is too much information to fit on a graph. And D, graphs usually display numbers while flow charts usually display text. Is it D?
Yeah, D as in dog, right? For number 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, you can have like a little bit of text on like a chart, well, on a graph, but you could see where if you have like a lot of text on a graph, it's going to look really messy and it's going to be hard to read. You know, Flowchart is a little more simplified, and it's usually, you know, deals a lot less with numbers, right? We don't have numbers involved with our flowchart here. This is all dealing with an order of events. And that's the other thing too, you know, graphs, you know, will often display time, right? Just like our Illinois manufacturing establishments. But the flowchart also sort of a bridge between a timeline and a graph. You know, it's a way to display information. It does sort of move through time, typically a much more a very short time span, right? It's not like the timelines we looked at that might go through like World War II or you know several years. It's usually a lot more condensed. All right, and then we have another one here, and back to our Plessy versus Ferguson flow chart. And so you know the event, as we know, in 1890. An African-American man named James Plessy sat in a railroad car designated only for white people. He was told to move, refused, and he was arrested. So this leads to the case. Plessy's case reached the U.S. Supreme Court. His attorneys argued that the whites-only car was a violation of the 13th and 14th Amendments. The first decision, in a 7-1 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1886, the court ruled that separate but equal facilities for African Americans and white people did not violate the 14th Amendment. Okay, so finally, a second decision, so related to Plessy versus Ferguson, was the much later case of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And at that point, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities violated the 14th Amendment and overturned the Plessy decision. So it took, you know, half a century, well, more than half a century, really. But then they reversed that decision that separate but equal is not constitutional. A big, you know, both these cases were landmark cases, Plessy versus Ferguson being the one that established separate but equal. And then Brown versus Board in 1954 was the one that reversed that case and considered that type of treatment no longer constitutional. Okay, so number 5. Tracy, would you like to read number 5 for us?
Yes. What led the court case Plessy and Ferguson? A. James Plessy sat in the car reserved for white passengers. B. There were railroad cars for each ethnic group. C, there were a ruling in the case of Brown v. Board of Education. D, the U.S. Congress passed the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Let's improve. B.
A.
A.
Yeah, you're on the right track there, but it was just the fact that particularly James Plessy, sat in a car reserved for white passengers, and that's what led to that case, right? So 5 is A. Okay, and our last one on the quiz, Christiana.
I'm sure can we.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Sorry.
Okay. Number 6.
Yep.
Which 2 levels of government were in possible conflict in the Plessy decision? A, federal and state governments. B, state and local government. C, country and state governments. D, two parts of federal government. A?
Yeah, A. So this was the question that we had that was answered in our little audio clip, right?
Yep.
That the lady was talking about. So yeah, it's A, federal and state governments, and that's right. One of the roles of the Supreme Court. We've talked about how they review bills that go through Congress and determine whether or not they're constitutional. So they make sure that legislation that goes through is basically constitutional. One of their other jobs, is to see, if there's a conflict between states' rights and the federal government. So is a state overreaching, if it's determined something in a lower court, like in a state court, or if there's a ruling, does the federal government need to step in, to maintain constitutionality? That's what really comes into play in that second decision, right? Because that was in Alabama, I believe, the Brown versus Board case. At that point, the federal government is saying you can no longer do this. You can no longer continue the separate but equal activity. We have to integrate our schools now. We have to get rid of these old Jim Crow laws. So yeah, federal and state governments, impossible conflict there. All right. So that was the quiz. Our 6 questions there. So 1 was D as in dog. 2 was C for cat. 3 was A. 4 was D as in dog. 5 was A. And 6 was A. Okay. All right, now let's do the workbook. Okay, and again, charts, graphs, and flowcharts present various types of information in a visual format. Line graphs and bar graphs are especially useful for showing change over time. Circle graphs show the relationship of the parts to a whole. Flowcharts are useful for presenting information shown in sequence, right? Order of events. Each step is usually explained by words within a figure, with the order of the sequence most often designated by arrows, showing you the way the information's moving, what came first. A flowchart may describe a simple sequence, a complex and interconnected sequence, or a cycle. So you can actually have, a flowchart that goes around, right? Like in a circle. So be sure to determine exactly what information is presented on a chart, graph, or flow chart. Titles of these visuals can help you do so. Also, carefully read all of the labels included on a chart, graph, or flow chart. Labels help you understand what each part of the visual represents. And just like I mentioned, you also want to make sure you understand the values. And right here, starting off, let's take a look at our graph here. And we got a pie chart here as well. So on the left, we have internationally born population in the US from the years 1990 to 2010. And always take note, right? On our y-axis, it's population and it's per million, per millions. So, right, 15 million, 25, 35 million, and 45. And again, that's within 10 million increments, right? Between 15 and 25, 25 and 35, 35, 45. And then our years at the bottom across the x-axis, 1990 to 2000 to 2010. So 10-year increments there, from 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2010. Our text says the slope of the line on this line graph represents the increase in the United States foreign-born population for each date. So now let's take a look at our pie chart or circle graph. They're calling it a circle graph. Sometimes we'll see it as pie chart. Again, internationally born population by state. And this is for a specific year, right? So it's for 2010. And we have a color key. I'm not real thrilled about the colors they chose here because they're very little distinguishing between, some of these colors. They're not, they're two of these almost look completely white. But anyway, what you have there by color is the percentage of the population by state represented in each color, right? So blue being California, yellow, New York, Texas might be a grayish, Florida, white, New Jersey's a very light blue, Illinois is like a light yellow, Massachusetts maybe white as well. It's kind of hard to say, but you get the point here, right? So what it's showing there is in blue, California had 25% internationally born population by state. So, that means that whether they're citizens or immigrants, that population was born outside of that state and has immigrated there or moved there or came with family, whatever it may be. So 25.4% of California's population is international, right? Comes from other places. The next being New York, and then right after that is Texas. So we see here, it says the labels on the circle graph identify the part of the whole that the segment represents. So if we added up all our percentages, it's going to come to 100%, right? That's usually how a pie chart or a circle graph works, right? That percentages from 32 here all the way around to the 2.5. If we plug that into a calculator and add it up, it's going to equal 100%. Okay, so let's start our workbook. All right, let's see what it says here. On content topics. So a decrease on a graph or chart is not always bad, and an increase is not always good. If a chart shows a change in infant mortality rate, a decrease would be positive, and an increase would cause concern, right? So what we're going through with COVID, right? With Omicron right now, we're seeing a lot more cases. So that increase, if we were to plot that, and again, if you turn on your TV and you watch the news, you're probably going to see like a line graph or a chart that's showing an increase in cases right now. And of course, we want to see that going way, 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 way down. So that's one example where an increase is bad and you want to decrease. Number of, employment, that would be a good increase, increase in overall employment in the US, something like that. is good. Inflation would be bad, right? We don't want to see a graph going like this when it comes to inflation. We want to see it going like that. Same thing with like gas prices, we want them down. So that's an idea there. You know, you have to be real careful at the data you're looking at, how it's represented. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? It doesn't always necessarily coincide with the way the chart or the graph is moving. All right, so Grace, could you read question 1 for us, please?
Okay. Which of the following states is third highest in the total number of internationally? Please, the question.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Internationally born residents. Is it D?
So it's B.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's what I was. Yeah, sorry about that. I was going to go back to the graph so we could take a look. Yeah, so if we're looking at the third one, right? So California's here, right? The green just represents all other states. So we don't really want to look at that because that's, you know, just everybody else. So what we want to look at, right, is California first in blue, and then yellow is New York, and then in whatever light color that is, 10.4% is Texas. Now, something else you might want to remember about pie charts, it's not it won't always be this way, but if you look, the states are organized by their percentage as well here, right? So California, New York, and then Texas is third, right? So yeah, B as in boy for Texas for number 1. And number 2, Tracy, could you read 2 for us?
Yes, number 2, by about how, number 2?
Yeah, sorry, there we go.
By about how much did the internationally born population of the United States increase between 1990 and 2010? A, about 500,000. B, about 6 million. C, about 10 million. D, about 20 million. How much international bond? 19. 19.
So we're looking at the total time, or we're looking at the total line, right? From 1990 to 2010.
1990 maybe 10 million, and 2010 maybe 40,000 or 40 million. So the distance is about 20. No.
Yeah, very good. 20 million.
20
so
million.
yeah, yeah. So you have to. This is where it gets a little weird because we don't have the way that the graph is split up. So we have to estimate, right? That first plot point there. Okay, that looks about like 20 million. We're going to have to estimate. You know, yeah, it falls about in the center. Then we go to our top number, and we'll go ahead and say about 40 million. And so, you know, 40 million minus 20 million, that's going to leave 20 million. Okay. And of course, you know, when it comes to test taking, consider the values of your answers. So if it's just making sure that it aligns, right? So once I see that all of these are, you know, 6, 10, 20 million, okay, I know it's probably not like this number falls on like 17,549, so, you know, something like that. It's going to be a pretty round number that it's indicating. So D is in dog for number 2. Okay. Christiana, let's take a look here. We got some more information. New flowchart. So the Spanish-American War was a brief conflict that lasted less than 1 year, but when it ended, the United States was a changed nation. As a result of winning the war, the United States suddenly was in control of former Spanish territories reaching from Cuba to the Philippines. So the events leading to the start of the Spanish-American War in, I think this was 1898, so right before the turn of the century. So the first thing that happens, rebels in Cuba start a war of independence against Spain. So Spain still controlled Cuba at this point. It was one of their, colonies, one of their territories, and Cuban nationals, or the Cuban people were starting to rebel. That's our first box. So Spain uses harsh measures to put down the rebellion. Newspapers print exaggerated tales of Spanish brutality, causing Americans to turn against Spain. So there was accounts that were coming into the nation, and that led to the American people starting to, have some animosity towards Spain and what they were doing to Cuba. And of course, they also were in control of the Philippines at this point. President McKinley sends the battleship Maine to Cuba. So one of our warships goes to Cuba as sort of to police the waters there. On February 15th, 1898, an unexplained explosion destroys the Maine and kills 267 crew members. There's some thoughts that, of course, the what was believed to happen is that, and what pulled us into the war was that Spain had destroyed the Maine, that they had sunk it, that they had attacked it. But there's also possibly, could have been an explosion on board, could have been fuel or something, a fire or something. So, but there was a belief, at least, that this was caused by Spain. And then, although the source of the explosion is unknown, several U.S. newspapers fanned the flames of public anger against Spain. So they're printing that, Spain had sunk the USS Maine. It's, leading to war. And then finally, President McKinley declares war. U.S. Is victorious. U.S. victory takes only 8 months. So there's only about 8 months of fighting there. All right, so from our first flowchart box there, where a rebellion starts in Cuba, to the end there where President McKinley declares war and the U.S. wins their war against Spain. And this we talked about the Monroe Doctrine before. This was McKinley, would cite that as an idea. Spain's kind of messing around in the Western Hemisphere. On our side of the pond, we're going to not allow that. So that was, part of his reasoning to go to war with them. Okay, let's see here, Tracy. How about we go back up to you for number 3?
Yes. Why were Spain and Cuba fighting against one another prior the Spanish-American War? A. Spain wanted independence from Cuba. B. Spain was attempting to push down a Cuban rebellion. C. Spain was an ally of the United States, which were fighting against Cuba. A Spanish ship has blown up in Havana Harbor. Spain and Cuba fighting again. I think B, Spain was attempting to put down the Cuban rebellion.
Yeah, B as in boy. Right, yeah. That's right there at towards the top, there was a rebellion, and Spain tries to put down the rebellion. Yep, so number 3 is B as in boy. And our same flow chart for number 4. Grace, how about you take number 4 for us?
Okay, how did newspapers influence the actions of the U.S. government before the Spanish-American war. A, newspapers refused to print stories about Spain's action in Cuba. B, members of Congress controlled what newspapers printed about Spain. C, newspapers turned American public opinion against Spain with sensationalized stories. And D, newspaper editors funded Cuba's rebellion against Spain. Is it B?
It's C. C is in cat.
C.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, this time, you know, the press had a lot of influence, you know, just, well, I mean, it does, of course, today as well. Social media probably has more so than it, or at least equal to what the news has today. But at that point, the newspapers was where you got most of your information. So they could really influence things. And they really turned public opinion against Spain, which, you know, led to more pressure on President McKinley and his staff to do something about the situation in Cuba. All right, yeah, so 4 is C. I have a cat that's trying to attack me right now on my lap, so here we go. All right, number 5. Christiana, you want to take number 5 for us?
Okay. In which of the following ways did the Spanish-American War change the United States? A, it no longer considered Cuba an army. B, it's considered to get involved in additional conflict to gain new territories. C, it became a world power and had to act with that in mind. D, it began to
curtail
individual rights at home. B,
C. Yeah, the difference between B and C basically. So here it's stating that it decided to get involved in additional conflicts to gain new territories. So that's sort of implying that, you know, President McKinley and maybe the War Department or something along like this, like, hey, let's go get new territory. Which really wasn't the case. We were still, you know, pretty much isolationist. But we were becoming a big world power. You know, we were becoming a much richer nation by, you know, before we get to the 20th century. We were industrialized. You know, we were manufacturing. We were, you know, inventing. We were expanding. So we had become a world power, economically at least, and so that led to, you know, us not wanting that type of influence in our backyard, or in this case, in you know, right below us in Cuba. So we decided to act. As a result of that, and a little bit ironically, maybe, we then became a protectorate of Cuba. You know, and we also basically were in control of the Philippines. So we always, you know, Americans and our sort of memory of ourselves think that we have always promoted what's the word I'm looking for? Independence, right? And self-governance by people. But we have, you know, taken territories, right? We still have territories like Puerto Rico and American Samoa that aren't states. You know, those people are recognized as American citizens, but you know, we were kind of in the colonizing game to some degree. So, but anyway, yeah. So we did have control of the Philippines and Cuba for a while there after the Spanish-American War. So 5 is C as in cat. And we have a new graph here. We have a circle graph showing the presidential election of 1908. And this is something else. You may see graphs, you know, 2 or 3 graphs together displaying information about the same event or the same idea, but one may be more specific. In this case, what we're showing is the popular vote in the first graph, right? We've talked about this. So the popular vote are the people that went out to the polls and they voted for either Thomas Heston, Eugene Chafin, Eugene Debs, William Jennings Bryan, or, excuse me a second, I have a cat on my table that I need to move. So they either voted for one of these gentlemen. And it shows here that, you know, William Howard Taft got the largest percentage of the popular vote, right? 51.57%. William Jennings Bryan, second most with 43.04% of the vote. And then we see our smaller percentages there for the rest of the field. A little easier to see. They picked a little better colors, I think, this time than they did before. And at the bottom, we have the electoral vote. So, of course, each state has the popular vote, and then it's calculated to determine how many electoral votes the candidate wins. So in this case, Taft received 66.5% of the electoral votes, and William Jennings Bryan receives 33.5%. So of course, Taft became president. And again, we see that none of the other candidates won any electoral votes. They did not receive enough of a popular vote in any of those states to receive electoral votes. And of course, if we added those up, real simple, right? 33.5% plus 66.5%, that's going to give us 100%. Okay. So, Sasha Gay, would you like to read number 6 for us?
It says, which of the following statements is accurate? A, 3 candidates received no electoral votes. B, Taft won a larger percentage of the popular vote than he did the electoral vote. C, Bryan finished first in the popular vote. D, the 2 top candidates together received less than 75% of the popular and electoral vote. A?
Yeah, number 6 is A. 3 candidates received no electoral votes. Only Taft and Bryan receives part of the electoral votes there. So 6 is A. C, 7. Tracy, would you like to read number 7 for us?
Yes. The Homestead Act of 1862 opened the possibility of land ownership to millions of people from all walks of life, including single women, farmer, enslaved workers, immigrants, and farmers without land of their own. For a $12 fee, a person could claim 160 acres of public land. He or she was required to build a house, live on the land, and farm it for 5 years. Then after, 2 neighbors vouched for the fact that he or she had done so. For an additional payment of $6, the homesteader became the legal owner of the land and received a deed. About 10% of the land area of the United States were settled under the Homestead Act. It was rebuilt in 1976, but continued in effect in Alaska until 1986.
Yep. Yeah. So we talked about the expansion of the United States across the continent, right, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We had most of that land, of course, was owned by the federal government, like the Louisiana Purchase. Once we purchased it, unless you already had claimed ownership or something like that, there was a lot of unclaimed territory. Basically, it was open territory. So we needed people to settle that, and the federal government offered everybody for $12. Now, of course, in 1862, $12 was considerably more money, but it was still a reasonable fee. You pay the federal government $12, you get your little covered wagon, and you go out to Nebraska or Oklahoma or wherever, and we're going to give you 160 acres of public land. All you have to do is maintain it. You build a house on it, you farm it, you live there for 5 years, and as long as somebody can basically reference, or you have somebody as a witness that can tell the federal government that yes, Matt has lived on this land for the last 5 years and has farmed it and improved it, you get ownership of that land. That's how it worked. And that's how, what we see in the graph here, which we'll discuss in a second, a lot of people took advantage of that. What is really crazy though, we think about, if you ever seen we think about the frontiersmen and the settlers moving out west. A lot of that was prompted by the Homestead Act. Find your fortune in the West, sort of that little house on the prairie kind of an idea. But this went all the way into the 1980s, where you could go to Alaska and, my family, when I was little, could have decided that I don't know if the fee was the same. I don't know if it was still $12, but they could have gone to the federal government and said, we want 160 acres in Alaska. And they could have moved our family, to somewhere in remote Alaska, and we would own, 160 acres. That didn't end until, my lifetime, at least. So then our graph, what it shows there is how many people took advantage of that. Homesteads from 1871 to 1960 under the Homestead Act. So starting in 1871 to 1880, there was almost 64,515 homesteads that were established through the Homestead Act. And then we see that number really start to increase. And again, what we have here is a bar graph, right? Instead of a line graph. So each one of those bars represents that number. 1881 to 1890, we see a huge takeoff there. And then, of course, between 1881 to 1911, 1920, where in that span of almost a decade, 1911 to 1920, 439,000 homesteads were created out of the Homestead Act. And then we start seeing it drop back down, right, between 1921 and 1930, where we start, having issues with the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and things like that. And then we've settled a lot of the country by there's still a lot of open space in the United States, but it became less appealing after, say, the World Wars and, dropped off, and there was different opportunities for people to acquire land and things like that by the time we get to the 1940s and 1950s. So yeah, that was one way that we settled a lot of the U.S. Millions. Well, over 1 million at least here. So number 7, Christiana, would you like to read question 7 for us?
Okay. Number 7. It says, which of the following statement is which of the following statement correctly characterize the information presented in the graph? A, the number of homes increased steadily between the 1870 and 1960. B, the early part of the 20th century was the busiest period for homesteading. C, there was no homesteading after 1950. D, there were more homesteaders between 1911 and 1920 than all previous decades combined. C?
It's B. B as in boy. The early part of the 20th century was the busiest part. So between 1901 to 1920, right? That early part there. So the other ones, of course, there was homesteading after 1950. The text even mentions that, right? That it went on until 1986. The number of homesteads increased steadily between the 1870s and 1960s. Yeah, that's not necessarily true, right? So most of that occurred between 1871 to 1911, where we saw a lot of growth, and then it starts to drop back down well before we get to 1960. And then for D, or more homesteaders between 1911 and 1920 than all previous decades combined. Actually, that you have to look at you have to add that up, right? So yeah, that was by far the most occurred in 1911 to 1920, but it wasn't more than all of the rest. So if you had that like in a pie chart, like a circle graph percentage wise, you would still have, if you just had a pie chart and you had 1911, 1920 and all the rest, that piece of your pie chart would still be bigger than that 1911 to 1920 decade. And that's what it's going for there. So you'd have to add it up to see that what it's talking about there is all the previous decades combined, and that's well over 439,000. Maybe not well over, but it's still significant. All right, so B as in boy for number 7. Let's see here. So our Homestead Act again. Sasha Gay, could you read number 8 for us?
Which of the following was most likely the result of the Homestead Act? A, there were fewer landowners throughout the United States. B, slavery continued many years beyond what it would have without the act. C, many people felt a stronger tie to the federal government. D, cities were abandoned as people set out to own homesteads. I'm thinking either B or D.
So C, actually. This one's a little subjective. So it is a cause and effect sort of idea, right? We're talking about a result. So what would be one of the results of the Homestead Act? So we could rule out A, right? Obviously, there were certainly more landowners throughout the United States because of the Homestead Act, not less. B, slavery continued many years beyond what it would have. Well, the Homestead Act really didn't, start until after slavery. So we can eliminate that one. And then finally, we can eliminate cities were abandoned as people set out to own homesteads. Well, we know, we'll because there's still cities are populated. That one we know there's no mention that cities were suddenly abandoned so people could take advantage of that. And of course, common sense also tells us that people were still populating cities. So that leaves C for cat for number 8. And it was a way that we see the government work is more visible today than it was, in the 1800s. You might not encounter that much government, other than say the post office or, something like that, or maybe some roads or something. So this particularly was a connection between the American citizen and the federal government, right? It was a direct link. And it was a way that they identified more so with their federal government, because you just didn't see your federal government work like you do today, whether it's with roads or whether it's, through certain benefits, through the military. We just see it on the news, we see it in social media. But in the late 1800s, you really just didn't interact that much with your government. So C for cat for number 8. And okay, yeah, new bar graph here. So Alabama rural and urban population, 1900 and 1910. So in our sort of cream colored yellow box there, it's the urban population of Alabama from around year 1900, and then again in 1910. And of course, the population in blue is the rural population. So the urban population, of course, the people that are living in cities, where the blue population are those that are living on farms or maybe small, sort of like farm towns and things like that. Our y-axis up the side is dealing with population by the thousands. So that gets a little tricky here, right? Because we're starting at 500, right? So that means 500,000. And we add another zero. So we're talking about 1,500,000. And then at the very tippy top here is 2 million. Okay. So that, always make sure you understand the value there. When you start adding numbers to it, sometimes it gets a little, you gotta think about that. So 500,000, 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million. And then across our x-axis at the bottom is the years. And we're only dealing with basically 2. So 1900 and 1910, right? Grace, how about number 9 for us?
Okay. Number 9. In which of the following ways could Alabama's population in both 1900 and 1910 breaks be described? A. Alabama's population was divided almost evenly between urban and rural areas. B. The state population was heavily urbanized. C. Most people in Alabama lived in rural areas. And D. The state had more than 2 million people. Is it B?
C. C is in cat. So, right, we're looking at that rural population, whether it's 1900 or 1910, it is dominated by a rural population, right? Most of the people in Alabama at that time lived rurally. Right, so number 9 is C is in cat. Okay, number 10, Tracy, could you read number 10 for us?
Yes. By 2010, how has Alabama's population changed? A. The population increased by fewer than 1,000. B. The population was slightly more urbanized. C. The population was more than 90% urban. D. The population had decreased. The rural and urban area. 19 urban. D.
Yeah.
The
B as in
population.
boy.
Yeah, wait minutes.
Yeah.
Not
So
injury. Injury. A.
So, sorry, I thought you said B or earlier there. So it's B as in boy. So
B.
Yeah, it's slightly increased its urban population, right?
Yes.
It did increase more than 1,000, right? Because that uptake here in both accounts, when we're dealing with the population in the thousands, we know that that's going to be more than just 1,000. So it certainly increased more than 1,000. Not a whole lot, but it did. And then C, of course, we know that it's not anywhere close to 90%. It's way, way more rural than it is urban. So that's incorrect. And then finally, the population had increased in both rural and urban areas, or decreased. Well, it did increase, right? It increased about the same for each. It increased a little bit for urban and it increased a little bit for rural on both. So there was no decrease over that time. So number 10's B. Okay. And so this one, we have another bar graph, and we're going to have a paragraph here at the bottom to fill in the blanks. Okay. So campaign expenditures, House of Representatives between 2000, 2010 net dollars. So what we see here, what it's showing, representing on our y-axis running up and down, from the year 2000 at the bottom to the year 2010, we're seeing the challenger and the incumbent, right? So the challenger is the person that's running against the person that's in the House of Representatives. So like, let's say like AOC, right? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. When she comes up for re-election, right? She's now the incumbent. So somebody will no doubt challenge her and there may be several people challenging her for that spot. So this would basically showing how much money the incumbent raised and how much money the challenger raised. And on the x-axis across the bottom, we have the number in dollars, right? So 250,000 is our first increment, 550,000. So it's going in increments of 300,000, right? 250, 550, 850, 1.1 million, 1.4 million, 1.7 million, right? So what we see here, of course, is that the incumbent outpaces the challenger in acquiring money for their campaign by a lot. We see by 2010, an incumbent raises close to about 1.5 million average for their campaign, or that's actually expenditure. Sorry, not what they raise, but actually what they're spending on their campaign. So they're spending about 1.5 million on their campaign in 2010, whereas their challenger is spending less than 800,000, right? They're spending maybe about 750,000, 700,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. So along the way here, incumbents are just totally outspending their challengers when it comes to their re-elections. Okay, that's basically what that's showing us there. So I'm going to go ahead and read the paragraph, and I'll call on you guys to answer for us. So it says here, the increasing cost of campaigning for the House of Representatives, especially the cost of blank in the media. Tracy, the increasing cost of campaigning for the House of Representatives, especially the cost of blank.
The cost of DP. C.
Yeah. Yeah, C, political advertisements. That one's a little, this one you have to sort of inference. You have to use inferences and you have to kind of imply. So don't get that information in the graph, right? Yeah. But the clue in there is media. In the media. So that's telling us that we're probably talking about commercials, right? We're talking about political advertisements. So the increasing cost of campaigning for the House of Representatives, especially the cost of C, political advertisements in the media, has made many representatives virtual part-time legislators and full-time, Christiana? Full-time what? Fundraisers, congresspeople, presidential candidates, or television actors?
Is it D or A?
A. Yeah, you're on the right track, right? With television actors, they feel like that sometimes. But yeah, A, fundraiser. So it's implying that they're many representatives, virtual part-time legislators, they're spending more time raising money than actually doing the job that they've been elected for. That's what that's implying there. And then, although the quest for campaign financing places a heavy burden on members of Congress, they continue to hold a significant advantage over Grace? Media reporters, professional fundraisers, presidential candidates, or D, challenger candidates.
Is it C?
It's D. So thinking about the context, right? Although the quest for campaign financing places a heavy burden on members of Congress, they continue to hold a significant advantage over D, challenger candidates, running against them. So running against them is going to be your context clue there, right? That's going to be the challenger candidate. All right. Now I'm going to go ahead and finish off last two here. So blank also have the advantage of being more familiar to voters due to their visibility in the news media. So that, of course, is B, incumbents, right? Incumbents also have the advantage of being more familiar to voters due to their visibility in the news media and the salary staff that assist them, right? Because they're already elected, they're already in the news cycle, they already appear on TV, they've already been elected. So that's your context there. Voters due to their visibility in the news media and the salaried staff that assist them. The escalating imbalance in fundraising between challengers and incumbents has contributed to the high rate of blank to Congress. So the high rate of C, re-elections to Congress, leading to demands for campaign fundraising reform and even for term limits. So everything we're doing here is basically inference. It's based on the knowledge that we can gain from that bar graph. So challengers and incumbents, the escalating imbalance in fundraising between challengers and incumbents has contributed to the high rate of re-elections, right? So if the incumbent is raising that much money, where'd my graph go? I got like one piece of the graph there popping up. There it is. There's the rest of it. Right. So it's showing if the incumbents raise that much more money than the challenger, you can imply, right? You can infer that they're probably getting reelected more than their challengers or getting elected again. So C is re-elections. I keep having a problem with things popping in and out there. There it is. All right, so we can submit that. All right, let me run through our answers real quick here before we take a break. So 1 was B as in boy, okay? 2 is D as in dog. 3, B as in boy. 4 was C as in cat. 5 was C as in cat. 6 was A. 7, B. 8, C as in cat. 9 was C as in cat. 10 was B as in boy. And then 11 was our text with our fill in the blank. So 11, C, political ads. A, fundraisers. D, challenger candidates. B, incumbents. And C, re-elections. Okay, so that basically gives us several ways to look at data. So bar graphs, line graphs, the circle graphs or pie charts, all of which are new ways to look at data. Flow charts, of course, are, what's going on with my screen? I am just got stuff popping up here. It's going to end the recording real quick. Okay, there we go.